All right, let's dive right in, shall we? Today we're tackling Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, it's a fascinating look at why some nations, well, succeed, and others unfortunately don't. And it goes way beyond those simple explanations we often hear, like geography or culture.
Right, right. Acemoglu and Robinson, they make this compelling argument and say it all boils down to institutions.
Okay, institutions, so not just like the buildings.
No, we're talking about the rules of the game, the systems, both economic and political, that really shape how a nation functions.
Gotcha. So like what are the incentives? How is power distributed? That kind of thing.
Exactly. And they break it down into these two main types of institutions, inclusive and extractive.
Okay, those sound pretty self-explanatory, but let's break it down. What does an inclusive institution look like in the real world?
Well, picture this. 17th century England after the Glorious Revolution. You've got property rights being solidified, a fairer legal system emerging, and the power of the monarchy getting checked.
So a more level playing field.
Precisely. It encourages people to participate, innovate, invest, because they know the rules are fair and they can benefit from their efforts.
Okay, that makes sense. So then on the flip side, what about those extractive institutions? What's a good example of that in action?
Oh, the Spanish conquistadors in Mexico. That's a prime example.
Oh, right, yeah.
They come in, they plunder the existing wealth, exploit the indigenous labor.
Set up a system that only benefits a tiny elite at the top.
Exactly. And sadly, that model, that extraction, it kind of casts a long shadow, contributing to those economic disparities we still see in the region today.
Wow, that's a stark contrast, just seeing how these different institutional paths can have these long-lasting impacts.
Oh, absolutely.
Are there any, modern-day examples that really bring this home, this contrast?
One of the most powerful examples in the book, and it's become pretty famous, is the story of Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora.
Okay, Nogales, I've heard of this. They're right next to each other, right?
Yeah, literally a fence separating them. But the difference in their realities, it's worlds apart. Nogales, Arizona, it benefits from those inclusive institutions we talked about. Higher living standards, better public services, businesses are thriving.
Yet on the other side in Sonora.
Well, it's struggling, Corruption, weak rule of law. It's a system that seems designed to benefit just a few.
That's heartbreaking, especially considering they're right next to each other. It really drives home the point that these institutions, they're not just abstract ideas, they have these real, tangible effects on people's lives.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now, the book, it dives deep into history, tracing the development of these contrasting paths. And I think it'd be really interesting to start with the Spanish conquest of the Americas.
Oh, definitely. A pivotal moment.
How did that event set the stage for these, divergent outcomes that we're seeing, even centuries later?
Well, the Spanish, they were driven by this thirst for gold and silver, right?
What?
So they went in and established extractive institutions. They weren't really interested in building a society that would benefit everyone. They were focused on extracting resources, enriching themselves.
Okay, yeah.
And that approach, unfortunately, it stifled economic growth and created this system of inequality that really persisted for, well, a very long time.
Okay, so now contrast that with what was happening up north in North America around the same time. What were some of those key institutional differences that put the English colonies on, well, obviously a different path?
Yeah, it's actually fascinating because you had these early English colonists. They weren't perfect by any means, but they faced a very different set of circumstances. There wasn't this, vast centralized empire ripe for the picking, no quick riches.
They had to kind of build from scratch.
Exactly. They had to build their own communities from the ground up. And in a way, that kind of pushed them towards a more inclusive model. They had to work together, establish property rights, and create systems that benefited a wider range of people if they wanted to succeed.
So almost like necessity became the mother of invention, so to speak.
Exactly, exactly. And you also have to remember, they brought with them certain political traditions, like the Magna Carta.
Right, which emphasized limits on the power of rulers.
And the importance of individual rights.
Yeah.
And that helped lay the foundation for a more inclusive society, at least in relative terms.
So even though both groups, the Spanish and the English, were initially driven by, profit, those different circumstances and the institutions they brought with them, they had a huge impact on the trajectories of their colonies.
Oh, absolutely. And these initial choices, the ones made centuries ago, well, they're still resonating today.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this book so powerful, you know?
Yeah.
It connects those seemingly distant historical events to the world we live in right now.
It's like, it's giving me this whole new perspective on global development. It's not just about these random factors. There are these deep structural forces at play. Now, I'm curious, let's hop across the Atlantic to Europe. What kind of historical deep dives do Acemoglu and Robinson offer to illustrate their argument there?
Well, one of the most, I think, intriguing episodes they explore is the Black Death.
The plague.
Yeah, that devastating plague that just swept through Europe in the 14th century.
You'd think such a catastrophic event would only hinder development.
You would think, right.
Yeah.
But surprisingly, it played a key role in weakening feudalism
Oh, wow.
and paving the way for, you guessed it, more inclusive institutions.
Okay, I've got to hear this. How did a plague lead to positive institutional change?
Well, think about it. The Black Death wiped out a massive chunk of Europe's population.
Right.
That created a sudden labor shortage. And that gave peasants more bargaining power, leading to, well, better wages and greater freedom.
So it unintentionally disrupted the existing power dynamics.
Exactly. It created this opportunity for those at the bottom to demand a more equitable system.
Wow.
This shift helped weaken the grip of the feudal lords, paving the way for a more inclusive society to, slowly emerge over time.
It's amazing how history can take these unexpected turns. But how does this post-Black Death Europe connect to the story of economic development, especially what comes later?
Well, now we're getting to the Industrial Revolution, this period of incredible technological innovation and economic growth. And the big question is, why did it start in England?
Yeah, good question. It's not like they had some special advantage in terms of resources or climate.
Right, right. And Acemoglu and Robinson, they make the case that it was England's unique institutional makeup,
Yeah.
Those steps towards greater inclusivity we talked about, limiting the monarchy, strengthening property rights, fostering a climate of entrepreneurship.
They created the perfect environment.
Exactly. England was primed to embrace and capitalize on those new technologies.
So it wasn't just about, inventing the steam engine. It was about having the right institutions in place to support innovation, risk-taking.
The diffusion of new ideas, absolutely.
But, not everyone was probably thrilled about these changes. Right?
Yeah, of course not. The book also explores this concept of creative destruction.
Yeah.
Where those in power often resist progress because it threatens their existing wealth and privilege.
That makes sense. If you're benefiting from the status quo, why rock the boat?
Right. It's self-interest trumping the common good. Classic case.
Yeah.
And the book gives examples of this resistance playing out in places like Austria-Hungary, Russia, the Ottoman Empire. They had opportunities to jump on board with industrialization.
But they clung to the old ways.
They clung to power, and ultimately, well, it hindered their own progress.
It's fascinating how fear can be such a powerful obstacle to progress. So we've got this central idea. Institutions, not just random factors, shape a nation's destiny. We've got Nogales driving that point home. And we've got these deep dives into history, the Spanish Conquest, the Black Death, the Industrial Revolution, showing how these institutional paths were forged. Where do we go from here? What else does Why Nations Fail have in store for us?
So, we've laid the groundwork. Now let's dig into how these institutional patterns can create, either a vicious cycle of poverty or this virtuous circle of prosperity. Acemoglu and Robinson, they argue that extractive institutions, just by their very nature, they tend to, perpetuate themselves.
Oh, so it's not just they exist, it's that they have these built-in mechanisms to resist change and keep nations stuck.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So tell me more about this vicious cycle. How does it work?
Think of it like this downward spiral, right? When power and wealth are concentrated in the hands of just a few, they have very little incentive to change a system that's working out pretty well for them. They manipulate the rules, they suppress any kind of dissent.
And they block economic opportunities for everyone else.
Exactly. Ensuring their continued dominance. It's a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, it sounds like this self-fulfilling prophecy.
All right.
The rich get richer and everyone else is left behind. Are there any concrete examples in the book that illustrate this vicious cycle?
Oh, there are some heartbreaking cases. Take Sierra Leone, for example.
Okay.
Decades of corrupt rule, fueled by control over diamond mines, left most of the population in poverty.
Right, the classic resource curse.
Yeah, those in power, they use their wealth to, maintain their grip, leaving little room for improvement.
It's tragic, you know? The people who need help the most are the ones being denied the opportunity to improve their lives. Are there other examples that show a similar pattern?
Oh, yeah. Guatemala is another one that comes to mind. A long history of, these powerful landowners exploiting indigenous labor, combined with the weak legal system, it created the system where, again, a small elite controlled pretty much everything. And that cycle of exploitation, it's been incredibly difficult to break.
These vicious circles, they sound almost impossible to escape. Is there any way to, like, reverse this downward spiral? Can nations struggling with extractive institutions find a path to a more positive trajectory?
Well, the good news is there's also a virtuous circle, a cycle that can propel nations towards prosperity.
Okay, that's more like it. Tell me more about this virtuous circle.
It starts with those inclusive institutions we talked about, the ones that encourage participation, innovation, a fair distribution of opportunities. When you have those in place, you create this positive feedback loop. Economic growth leads to greater political participation.
Which in turn strengthens those institutions.
Exactly. It's self-reinforcing, benefiting a wider range of people, creating a more stable and prosperous society.
That sounds a lot more hopeful. Any real-world examples that show this virtuous cycle in action?
The book highlights Botswana. After they gained independence, they deliberately chose a path of inclusivity. They embraced democratic principles, invested in education, infrastructure, fostered this climate of entrepreneurship.
So they were really proactive in creating a system that would benefit, everyone.
Right, and the results have been pretty remarkable. Botswana has achieved sustained economic growth. They've become one of Africa's most stable and prosperous nations.
That's amazing, a real success story. It shows that breaking free from those vicious circles is possible.
It is.
But, let's be realistic. Achieving sustained prosperity, it's a complex challenge, even when you know what works. What are some of the obstacles that nations face on this path?
One thing the book emphasizes is that there are no quick fixes.
Right.
Simply throwing money at problems. Like with foreign aid, it often fails to address those deeper institutional issues.
Because if the underlying systems are flawed, the aid just gets siphoned off by those in power.
Oh, exactly. And the book gives tons of examples where well-intentioned aid programs just haven't had much impact because those recipient nations lacked those crucial inclusive institutions.
So it's not just about providing resources. It's about fostering those fundamental changes that really empower people.
Create that sustainable path to prosperity, yeah.
What other challenges do we need to consider when we think about how to promote development?
Well, one of the trickiest cases they look at is China.
Ah, yes, China.
They've had incredible economic growth, but under authoritarian rule, which, seems to challenge the idea that you absolutely need inclusive institutions for progress.
Right, because China's model has gotten a lot of attention. How do Acemoglu and Robinson reconcile China's success with their main argument?
They acknowledge the impressive growth, but they argue that it's probably unsustainable in the long run without more political inclusivity. See, China's model has been effective in driving rapid industrialization,
Right.
but it lacks those checks and balances that you get with democratic institutions.
Which could lead to problems down the line.
Yeah, instability, and ultimately it might limit their potential.
So it's like building a house on a shaky foundation. Might look good for a while, but
Exactly. Acemoglu and Robinson, they believe that real lasting prosperity requires both economic and political inclusivity. Without those safeguards, there's a risk that growth will stall and the benefits won't be shared fairly.
so we've got these vicious and virtuous circles, the challenges of foreign aid, and this complex case of China. It feels like promoting institutional change and creating a more just and prosperous world, it's a huge task.
It is.
Where do we even begin? So we've covered a lot in our deep dive into why nations fail. We've explored how much power institutions have in shaping a nation's destiny. Now the big question, how can we use these insights to actually create a more just and prosperous world? I mean, where do we even start with something this complex?
It's true, there are no easy answers, but why nations fail, it does offer some valuable guidance. One key takeaway is the importance of broad-based empowerment.
Empowering people, giving them a voice and a stake in their own future? What does that actually look like?
Think about it this way. Strengthening democratic institutions, ensuring you have a fair legal system, and protecting those basic rights. Freedom of speech, assembly.
The things that allow people to organize and hold their leaders accountable.
Right. It's about creating those checks and balances so those in power, they can't just exploit the system for their own benefit.
Those are all crucial, but it just seems so daunting, especially in places where those extractive institutions are so deeply entrenched. Does this kind of change, can it happen gradually? Or does it require more, I don't know, radical shift?
Well, the book suggests that change can happen gradually. It doesn't always have to be a violent revolution.
Okay, so how do we nurture that kind of, gradual positive change? Where should we focus our efforts?
One way is by supporting those, grassroots movements, those organizations that are working within their communities to promote these inclusive principles.
It's about empowering those folks on the ground who are already fighting for a more equitable system.
Exactly. Amplify those voices. Give them the resources they need to challenge those power structures.
That makes sense. But besides supporting those grassroots efforts, are there other strategies that can help shift the balance towards inclusivity?
Another crucial point the book makes is we got to be careful about those, quick fixes, the things that sound great in theory but don't actually address the deeper systemic issues.
Like when foreign aid just gets poured into a country without tackling the underlying institutional problems.
Exactly. We've talked about this. If those systems are corrupt, that aid can actually end up reinforcing those power imbalances. It's so important to focus on those institutional changes, the ones that empower people, create a level playing field where everyone has a shot, not just a select few.
Why nations fail really pushes us to think beyond those surface-level solutions. Now, one thing that struck me as really relevant, especially today, is the role of technology. It seems like it could either make those extractive tendencies worse, or it could be a force for positive change. What do you think?
You're hitting on something important. Technology, it's a double-edged sword, right? The book highlights how it can be used to reinforce existing power structures.
Like how authoritarian regimes use surveillance to control information.
Right, censorship, all of that. But on the flip side, we've seen how technology can empower people, give them access to information, connect them in ways that can challenge those in power.
Think about social media's role in organizing protests or raising awareness about injustice.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial to be mindful about how we use technology. We need to recognize those potential downsides, but also harness that power to promote those inclusive principles.
It's not about demonizing technology. It's about being smart, using it wisely. And that brings us to another key takeaway: learning from history, which is, I think, what this whole book is about.
Absolutely. History gives us this incredible wealth of knowledge. It shows us what's worked, what hasn't. When it comes to building inclusive institutions and promoting prosperity, we can learn so much from those successes, but also from those failures.
It's about recognizing those patterns, understanding what shaped our world, and using that knowledge to make better decisions.
Exactly. It's about understanding that history isn't destiny. We can shape our future by learning from the past and making choices that create more inclusivity and opportunity for everyone.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive into why nations fail. It's given me a whole new way to think about global disparities and, most importantly, about solutions. It's a call to action, a reminder that we all have a role to play in making a better world.
It's a message of hope and responsibility, for sure. The challenges are huge, but understanding these dynamics of inclusive and extractive institutions, it gives us a place to start. It begins with that commitment to empower people, promote transparency, accountability, and create those conditions that allow everyone to thrive.
Why nations fail doesn't offer easy answers, but it does give us this powerful lens for viewing the world and a roadmap for building a more just and prosperous future. So let's keep these ideas in mind, continue these conversations, and work together to create a world where everyone has a chance to succeed. That wraps up our deep dive into why nations fail. Thanks for joining us.